Hi everyone, my name is Stefano De Clara and I'm Director of International Policy at IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. And I would like to welcome all of you to this event, which is jointly organized and hosted by IETA and the IEA. This event is part of the IETA ICAP Carbon Market Pavilion that is taking place over today and tomorrow. I will jointly moderating and hosting this side event together with Luca Lore at the IEA. As you might know, the event is titled Mind the Gap, a potential transition of the CDM to the Article 6.4 mechanism. And it really aims at discussing this topic. We should have been in Glasgow in these very days, negotiating this aspect and this topic. So we thought it could be worth spending the next 60 minutes or so having a discussion on where we are with this issue in the Article 6 negotiations and what the key options and key elements under discussions are. It is one of the key issues that are being negotiated and being discussed in the Article 6 negotiations. It's possibly also among the key issues in the Article 6 negotiations, the one that has the most impact for players that are currently active in the market and that are active in the world of the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms. And so it is a topic that directly speaks to the engagement and involvement of the private sector in the negotiations. We have an excellent set of presenters and speakers that will help us unpacking this issue and that will provide and bring different perspectives to the table. So we're looking forward to the discussion. And as I said, I'll be co-moderating this event together with Luca, and I would like to give Luca the floor now for a couple of welcome remarks. Luca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Luca Lore. I'm a climate policy analyst at the IEA, International Energy Agency, and I would also like to welcome all of you to this session that is jointly organized with IETA. But I promise that we didn't coordinate on the dress code between Stefano and myself. That's purely coincidental. As Stefano said, this session is going to focus on the possible transition of CDM to Article 6.4. We would like to discuss as much as possible technical aspects that are related to the possible transition of activities, governance, and regulatory requirements that are related to this transition. This topic is also being explored and analyzed by the IEA together with the OECD through the climate change aspect group, and we hope that we're going to be able to provide useful technical inputs to negotiations on this issue. As Stefano said, we have a fantastic panel today with a lot of experts from various institutions and party delegations as well. And we're going to first have two presentations, and this is going to be followed by a panel discussion. If you have any questions, we invite you to write these in the chat. And this session, we would like to run it under the Chatham House rule as much as possible. So if you would like to write publicly about this panel discussion, please seek prior approval from the speaker. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Amy Merrill-Steen, who is the Senior Legal Officer at the UNFCCC Mechanism for Transparency, Reporting, Review and Compliance at the UN Climate Change. Amy has led Article 6 Paris Agreement negotiation support since early 2015, including during the run-up and to and the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And before joining the UNFCCC in 2011, she worked in commercial legal practice at Linklaters as a senior climate change lawyer, supporting multinational development and investment banks to design and implement carbon finance and carbon trading structures in the UNFCCC, EU, and voluntary markets. So, Amy, over to you. And maybe if I can ask the non-panelists to please not only keep their muted, but also turn their camera on, please. Thank you very much. And Amy, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Stefano. It's a real pleasure to be joining you today. I was looking at the attendee list, and there's a really interesting mix of negotiators and real business people from the real world. And I see a lot of names of people that I've worked with in the past when I was a transactional lawyer, and also delegates who I work with now in my functions in the UNFCCC. So thank you very much for the invitation. Perimal Arumugam, my inseparable colleague at the UNFCCC, is also here. We decided I'd present, and Perimal will intervene as needed. If you could go to the next slide, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So you may be wondering why we're presenting. For those who are more at the higher level of these issues, I work for the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, and we deliver support to the international negotiations on Article 6 and on the Clean Development Mechanism. And so we've been asked to present around the implementation of the issue of CDM transition. And we're focusing, as has been highlighted, not on units, but on the actual activity process. Now, of course, these issues remain under negotiation still in Article 6. So everything I say here is based on the current negotiation texts, which are the ones that came out of the last COP that we did manage to hold in Madrid in 2019. And yes, hopefully we will have a COP this time next year. But this presentation does assume a really quite good knowledge of the issues at hand. We'll be able to answer clarifying questions afterwards, but I hope you do. I hope you are able to follow because it does require some quite detailed understanding of the CDM, some quite detailed understanding of Article 6, and also some fairly good understanding of the way that the UNFCCC as a treaty system works. More background you can find on the link on this page. If I could have the next slide, please, that would be great. So I think the issue that comes to hand when we talk about CDM activity transition is if we assume that the texts can maintain consensus around the activity transition that they seem to be gaining during the end of Madrid, and that largely similar conditions will be adopted when we do finally meet in Glasgow at the end of next year. The overriding principles of these transitions need to be around avoiding double governance under the UNFCCC, which is already a regime that's fairly heavy under the CDM, as you know, and also making sure that the actual activities that operate under the CDM now and want to join the Article 6.4 mechanism are actually able to do so, and not so baffled by the rules that they have to meet that they just give up, right? So I think one of the main narratives I want to deliver in this presentation is the need for everybody to engage in thinking about a consistent design logic for implementing these transitions. And I know that Lambert will speak later in a little bit more detail about sequencing as well. So hopefully our separately prepared slides will all sequence together nicely. Now, if you know the UNFCCC process very well, you will also know that there are a number of fora under the UNFCCC that report under the Convention, under the Paris Agreement, and under the Kyoto Protocol, and have very complex structures. But I think what's useful to understand is that while Article 6.4 is under the Paris Agreement and activities under the CDM are under the Kyoto Protocol, if there is a transition of activities from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement under those two mechanisms, that transition will start and eventually end. And so there's a need to sequence and style the control in a logical fashion. So taking that to a little bit lower level of detail, if a CDM activity is operating under the CDM's still active and is looking to transition, it's important to understand that the transition to the 6.4 mechanism should not be mandatory. It cannot be made a mandatory process. It's an invitation from the 6.4 mechanism system if and when it is agreed, and it is subject to certain conditions, such as the host country of the activity being having approved that, and that's based on the status of the texts as they stand, right? And so assuming that holds, there will be a pull, an invitation from the CMA to come over within a certain period of time from the CDM to the 6.4 mechanism. Now, you could support that process by having the CMP, the masters and mistresses of the CDM, to gently push activities to enable them to move across, to make it administratively easy. And so I think it's important to understand that that is implemented at the body level, even though the decisions are taken at the highest level of governance, which is the supreme bodies, as we call them, under the UNFCCC process. So the parties are the bosses, and they make the decisions, and they're implemented by the CDM executive board and the 6.4 supervisory board. But real control about individual activities will still sit to a great degree with host countries, countries that have approved the activity within their jurisdiction and can decide whether or not they do want to see them reappear under the Paris Agreement. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I have tried to show what that kind of complex array of decision making can mean in terms of how you design a logical sequence and a logical structure for this. So here on this chart, and I really hope you can do UNFCCC and acronyms well, because it's kind of essential here. The CMP is the body that oversees the Kyoto Protocol, and that's under which the CDM sits, and the CDM Executive Board, CDM-EB, controls the operations of the CDM. It supervises the CDM. The CMA is the supreme body, the countries for the Paris Agreement, and the 6.4 supervisory body is the body that is provided for under Article 6 for the 6.4 mechanism, and that will hopefully be established when decisions are taken in Glasgow. So what I've tried to do here is show a matrix of where power lies based on the way that the UN Framework Convention bodies generally operate. So supreme bodies, the CMP and the CMA, the top level, the party negotiations, these are great at ensuring coherence across different treaty regimes and giving control at the highest level. They are not so great, and you'll see that in the bottom 3 rows, they're not so great at actually implementing stuff because they have to get consensus among 190, 80 plus countries. And they're not very good at technical because they can't meet often enough or consult often enough on documents. So that's where the real implementation comes into play. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here is a diagram that tries to show how those various levels of competence and authority can be implemented. And it's quite small, and I expect it's quite difficult for you to see, especially if you're on a phone. But essentially what would happen in a well-orchestrated adoption of the decisions at the next COP in order to enable CDM activity transition would be the CMA would invite the CMP to see that it has allowed for CDM activities. And the CMP would say, well, thanks, we noticed that, that's great. And CDM activities, you know, we will help you. And so then you start to have a coordination between the 2 boards of each of these mechanisms. Now, the way in which they operate under the UN regime is limited by the fact that the blue and the green on your screens are different treaty regimes. One is the Kyoto Protocol, the other is the Paris Agreement. So unless the 2 bodies, the CDM Executive Board and the 6.4 Supervisory Body, are invited, asked or told to cooperate with each other, they can't actually talk directly to each other. And so that creates a need to be extremely coordinated at the top level, which is the 2 arrows at the top of that diagram. So that's the general constraint with the arcane world of UNFCCC negotiations. So if we could go to the next slide. But what does it really mean in practice? And here's where this diagram tries to show you where the pain points come for an activity that's trying to transition. Those of you familiar with the CDM and the registration process there will know that it takes quite some time not just to design a CDM activity, but also to get the necessary approvals. So in the CDM, a project that wants to be a CDM project has to get approval from the host country. And then when it's got that, that's the sort of key, that's a key piece of the documentation it has to submit to the CDM Executive Board. And the CDM Executive Board then goes through the technical requirements of the CDM activity and decides if it can be registered. So when you think about moving from the CDM, that authorization from the host party, which is the yellow box at the bottom of your screen, is quite essential. At the same time, under the 6.4 negotiations, it's completely foreseen that at this, just like in the CDM, the country in which the activity is located would have the say as to whether or not it can happen. And so there's another need for an approval there, right? And so the question is there a way to minimize that, that process of having, for the activity, for having to get another kind of approval? And you'll see that's depicted in the purple arrow on the bottom left-hand side. In order for the activity to be moved, if it wants to move, without it having to itself collect all the authorizations for transition, for withdrawal from the CDM and the like. So if you think of this as a new permitting regime, and you think of, you know, the complexities administratively that we see in normal operations of factories and other installations, when permitting regimes change, we need to try to find a way to minimize the burden of this transition on the activities that the host party has said can transition. There are, of course, requirements that will change in relation to the operation of the activity once it moves fully under the supervisory body. But a key issue is, how do you protect the investment interest in the activity by not making it so administratively exhausting that the activity itself just decides not to transition, or tries to leave the CDM but doesn't successfully make it to the 6.4 supervisory body. And I think that's, if we could go to the next slide, I think that's where I'd just like to leave it, knowing that Lambert will look a little bit more in detail at timing, and perhaps Pera and I can answer questions on that later. In any intergovernmental process where many decision makers are required for things to be agreed and there is a complex coordination to be implemented, it is really important to create positive consequentials. So if A happens in 6.4, then B can happen in the CDM. These are largely the same parties at the level of the KP and the Paris Agreement. The KP has a smaller group of parties within it, but KP parties are Paris parties. And so it should be possible to be strategic in those decisions and coordinate them well. As I said at the beginning, it's important to avoid doing twice what can be done only once. And then I think the thing that often goes forgotten when experts are in negotiation mode is that sometimes you don't need to regulate everything, and that administrative logic and efficiency can be used. For example, in the implementation of the Paris transparency regime, there is this concept of avoiding undue burden, and that might be a useful concept to include in this thinking process around CDM activity transition. And then, you know, I suppose this is a message to the negotiators that have joined this call and who have likely discussed these issues before. Focus on the needs of the client, which is the activities. It has to be feasible for these activities to transition if the political agreement is that they may. And so, ensuring that activities know what they need to do and how it can be done efficiently is really the goal in finalizing that agreement on CDM transition in the context of the wider Article 6 negotiations. So I hope that that wasn't completely baffling to the non-experts of CDM and Article 6. And I'll hand back to you, Luca and Stefano. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a fantastic Since starting presentation. And now let me turn to Lambert Snyder. For those who don't know him, Lambert is the research coordinator for international climate policy at Oke Institute and a member of the CDM executive board. He conducts research on international carbon market mechanisms and greenhouse gas emission accounting, and is an EU delegate in the negotiations of Article 6. Lambert, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I will build on Amy's presentation and look a little bit more practically what this could mean for the transition of activities and how it could be implemented in practice. So first of all, when talking about transitioning, we can transition different things. Regulatory documents, they could be used. CDM regulatory documents could be used by the 6.4 body. There could be institutional arrangements like the accreditation system of the CDM, which could be used under 6.4. There could be projects and there could be certified emission reductions. The latter topic is not part of this session. Next slide, please. So in terms of regulatory documents, I think the most important documents under the CDM are the project standard, the project cycle procedure, and the validation and verification standard. They basically set out how a project can get registered and how it can issue certified emission reductions and what the requirements are. And so I tried to map the current draft negotiation text against the existing standards. And I think many elements of the existing standards can be used, like the procedures, how proposals, submissions are being processed and checked for completeness, etc. But there are also some substantial amendments needed because the new 6.4 text includes requirements which are not there under the CDM. And just to list here, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to flag a few. So far we have talked about projects and programs under the CDM, but the 6.4 mechanism is more open. There may be also other activities, and that could, for example, include sector accrediting. We have host countries have a greater role, so they can make own arrangements for accreditation, for methodologies, and for renewal of crediting periods. We have a different type of approval and authorization. We have different crediting period length and different conditions for their renewal. We have this new principle of an overall mitigation in global emissions, which needs to be implemented. We have a need to avoid double issuance, also broader double counting, but for the mechanism in particular, double issuance is relevant because, for example, the CDM has very limited provisions to avoid double issuance, and maybe broader provisions would be needed. There are issues around non-permanence, as the TCR and LCR concept under the CDM will not continue. There's also a new principle of avoiding negative environmental and social impacts, which is not in that form in the current CDM modalities and procedures, and there's an appeals procedure. So this is just to flag these issues. And the important issue is to actually register projects or maybe even transition projects and issue credits under the 6.4 mechanism. You need kind of some procedures for that. So you need to have these type of documents in place. And so it's quite some work. I think the good news is from experience in the past, if you really speed up and you start that at the first meeting of the supervisory body, you give them Monday to start that work, it's possible to do that within a year, probably. Maybe it needs a little bit more, but maybe it's possible to do that within 1 year. Then there has been a lot of discussion also in the negotiations about methodologies. Methodologies may also need some updating. Again, we have activities that are different from projects and programs. We have a whole lots of discussions on baselines and their ambition and the principles, how they are established and whether they should be below business as usual, whether they should be consistent with NDCs and long-term strategies. Then again, there are host party arrangements. Host parties have a greater role in methodologies. They may be able to establish certain baseline requirements, for example, and the mechanism should contribute to the host party NDC, which is also a new principle. And maybe policies need to be treated different. At least the reference to how consistency with policies is referenced is different from under the CDM. There are many methodologies under the CDM, far more than 100, maybe 200, and tools. And so revising these is more a work program of several years. And some of them are clearly more frequently used, so the work could start on these, but it's a work program of several years, I would say. Then there's a procedure for the development and revision of methodologies. That procedure could basically be adopted with only relatively minor changes, in my view. The procedure could work more or less as it is. Next slide. And lastly, on regulatory documents, accreditation is also quite important. So the CDM runs a whole own accreditation system, which consists of the accreditation standard, accreditation procedure, and the performance monitoring of auditors. And here also, in my view, a lot of that could be taken one-to-one to the 6.4 mechanism. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are some revisions necessary, for example, for the competency of auditors. That's just an example, but by and large, a lot of that could be used under the 6.4 mechanism. Next slide. So in terms of institutional arrangements, I think one important question is what to do with this accreditation system. So whether designated operational entities can immediately continue to operate under the 6.4 mechanism. So one option is to temporarily, at the start of the 6.4 mechanism, use the CDM accreditation system. This avoids duplication. It's much simpler for DOEs and project participants, so it helps a prompt start. But it also raises some operational issues. For example, we have under the CDM a performance monitoring system. And so would the CDM then also monitor the performance of what's happening, what the entities are doing under the 6.4 mechanism, etc. So there are some tricky issues, but it would be probably the much simpler option. The alternative is to establish a new accreditation system, which could also lead to delays. Then we have an existing CDM registry, so there should be a 6.4 registry. Maybe from a software perspective, a possibility is to amend the CDM registry so that it's clearly separated, but to use the same software in some way and to minimize the effort to establish a new registry, or it could be completely separated. The same holds for panels and working groups. It may be very quick to initially use, for example, the CDM methodologies panel and the accreditation panel, or new panels can be established, which doesn't take very long. Maybe 2 supervisory board meetings are necessary for that. And then lastly, for designated national authorities, that's up to the parties to decide whether it should be the same entity or a different entity. Next slide. So there are a number of principles for the transition of projects. As Amy highlighted, host party approval is a key principle. Another principle is compliance with the 6.4 rules, and maybe there can be some temporary exceptions to that. And what's important is a clear division of responsibilities. And here's just an example. So it's important to clarify in decisions for how long issuance continues under the CDM and when issuance occurs under the 6.4 mechanism, so that there's no period where there's an overlap. The same holds for registration or for accreditation, where, for example, the CDM accreditation system could be used until the end of 2023, and then maybe the 6.4 mechanism could take over. And if there are still auditing activities under the CDM, they may use the auditing system managed by the 6.4 mechanism. Next slide. So here's a little bit a timeline or a possible timeline. So when we adopt rules for the 6.4 mechanism, hopefully at COP26 in November, December next year, then the question is, what should be the priority for the 6.4 body in order to enable a smooth transition? And in my assessment, implementing a registry and having the project standard, the project cycle procedure, and the validation and verification manual in place for the new mechanism, these core standards would be essential because they are a prerequisite for actually issuing, for processing, issuing requests, etc. And they could also cover a procedure for transition. And so ideally, these two tasks could be completed within a year, which would then allow units under the new mechanism to be issued from 2023 onwards, basically. At the same time, it's important to early think about the host party transition approval, because that could also delay the transition. And so maybe some countries can already think about what entity to designate so that the approval can be made quickly and in a timely manner. And then the issuance, I think an easy way also discussed in the negotiations is that for some time issuance of transitioned projects would be possible maybe with CDM methodologies, and that once new methodologies under the 6.4 mechanism are adopted, this is being phased out and newer methodologies must be used. Next slide, last slide. So to conclude, I think it's essential that there's both a decision by the CMA and the CMP on transition at COP26, and that this is a coordinated decision, right? As Amy pointed out, we need both bodies' decisions need to be taken. That should be clear on the division of responsibilities, like for how long, what activity is occurring under which of the two mechanisms. I think there should be no gap in claiming emission reductions. So there should be no period for which emission reductions, for which no units can be issued for emission reductions. But I think it's unavoidable that there's some delay until the issuance can occur under the 6.4 mechanism, because you need some procedure under the 6.4 mechanism to process the issuance, to assess whether they comply with the rules, and that therefore the project standard and the project cycle procedure are so important. Overall, I think it's really important that it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time, substantial revision of CDM regulatory documents is needed to make them aligned with the rules, modalities, and procedures. And I think key priorities for the supervisory body in its first years should be the implementation of the registry, and as I said, the adoption of the core standards to enable processing. And in parallel, of course, other processes can be started, like the revision of methodologies, the revision of the accreditation standard, etc. And I wonder whether it would be useful to use 2021 to develop such a detailed transition plan to prepare for the CMA and CMP decisions to be taken, but also maybe even to start thinking about what decisions the supervisory body may take once it's operationalized to kind of kickstart the work that is necessary. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lambert. This was really comprehensive and clear. I've seen that there are a lot of questions already in the chat. I would suggest that most of them we keep them for the subsequent discussion, but maybe there is one that is Lambert for you for clarification from Luis Robles. Why do you consider that CDM CERs cannot be issued from 1st January 2021?
I was waiting for this question, of course. As you're aware, this is an issue which is debated controversially within the CDM Executive Board. In my view, this is an issue which should be addressed by the CMP, but as there's no CMP this year, the CDM Executive Board is struggling with this issue. There are different views on this matter in the CDM Executive Board, and maybe the Secretariat can also amend on that. There are views that it's not within the authority of the board to take decisions on this matter. There are also views that the board may decide on this matter, and there are views that the CDM may continue after 2020, and there are views that it's legally and politically and technically not possible. I think that's a big debate on its own, and there are many policy and technical consideration being considered.
Thank you, Lambert. I now pass it over to Stefano for the subsequent discussion.
Thanks, Luca, and thank you also, Lambert and Amy, for the excellent presentations, which will be a really good basis for the discussion we're aiming to have now. So I would like to invite the speakers and the panelists to come online now and to turn their camera on. And what we will do now is that I will ask them to provide obviously their perspective and their views on this issue, and also a little bit of reaction to what was presented so far. And then after we do that, we'll open the floor for a Q&A with the audience. So thanks again for those of you that sent questions already, and keep those flowing in, because we will address as many as possible after the first round of panel remarks. So in this second part of the discussion, we have three excellent speakers. We have Simon Fullermeyer from the Swiss Federal Office, and Simon, he is the Swiss lead negotiator for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and also serves as the Swiss DNA to the CDM. We also have Ken Newcomb, and Ken is a pioneer of global carbon markets. Ken designed and launched the prototype carbon fund at the World Bank in the early days of the CDM. And today, Ken is the CEO of Sequest Capital, which is focused on delivering sustainable energy services and improved health mainly in NDCs using climate finance. And we will also have Sandra Greiner, who is lead consultant at Climate Focus in Amsterdam. Sandra works on market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, including on implementation of pilot activities and the rulemaking level for Article 6. And Sandra also represents the state of Gambia in the UNFCCC negotiations on Article 6 and provides technical advice. So we couldn't have a set of panelists more qualified to take the discussion forward. So having said that, I'll give you the floor to Simon, and I'll ask you to provide your perspective on this issue, and if you wish also to respond to what was presented. And I'll try to actually take the slides off so we can see each other in the face a bit more easily. Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Stefano. I try to turn on my my camera, but I'm being told by the app that there's the max of webcams is reached. So for now, I can't do that. But if other people turn their cameras off, there's some that are just blank, then maybe I can do it. But in any case, I hope you hear me well. And thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel and this very interesting discussion with really, I think, two excellent presentations from Amy and Lambert. So thanks a lot for that. I think I don't have much to add, and I think we want to give as much possibility, you know, for all the participants to pose their questions. I think just very few points, and I think mostly recalling what has already been said by the two presentations. I think it's important to note why this mechanism exists, both the CDM and the 6.4, and who created it. And because it's noteworthy, you know, the organizers of this panel have shared with us the participant list, and as you say also in the description of this webinar, this is a range of there's a range of participants here, you know, from different areas. And having gone through it quickly, I think there's a lot of participants from the private sector. I think that's a good sign. But it's also important to note that, you know, and I quote from just the CDM website as it stands. You know, the CDM has a purpose, and that is to have emission reduction projects in developing countries that can earn CRs and that can, I quote, be used by industrialized countries to meet part of their targets under the KP. That is a particular objective that was set out, and I think part of the debate that we all know is ongoing, that I think Lambert has also emphasized with this point of the delay, a certain delay in issuance is unavoidable. It's also important to take a step back and really figure out who created these mechanisms and what for. And having noted that, I think what Amy said, I can fully subscribe to. While, two quotes, the parties are the bosses, as Amy said, there's an absolute need, and I quote again, to focus on the need of the client. And that's why we're here, and that's why I can fully align myself with the calls for a smooth and easy and stay light transition wherever that's possible. Having said that, I think, as we said, the parties are the bosses, and as Amy explained very well in her presentation, these bosses, they do happen to meet on a CMP and CMA level. And that CMP and CMA level, due to very unfortunate circumstances this year, was unable to meet, and will probably only meet in a year's time. If that is so, vaccine is looking good, but who knows? And so I think, while noting that this is extremely unfortunate, the calls that we have heard, the letters that we have seen, sent to the CDMEB from different wide range of stakeholders, I think it's very good to express, these needs and interests and so on. But it's also noteworthy, again, to recall, I quote Amy, the parties are the bosses, and it's not supposed to sound arrogant or anything, but it's just, I think, a clarification of the governance structure that we are in and the realities that we face as they are. So, just having said all that, I think final 2 points. What is needed for this transition? And the text, the draft text doesn't give us a lot of clues as it currently stands, but it gives us 2 things, 2 very central things. The host party has to say yes to the notion that a project that is currently ongoing, that's in an active transition period, can continue. And then secondly, that project has to meet the new rules. And I think it's very clear that we can only assess these once we have agreed on them. And seeing again the situation that we're in, where these rules are not yet agreed, where we just talk about draft text that may or may not change fundamentally or not, we have to acknowledge the governance structure that we're in, the responsibilities that are assigned to different levels, and acknowledge that these decisions, as was, I think, portrayed very clearly in these presentations, will have to be taken on the CMP and CMA level. I stop here. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Simon, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A, I imagine. Ken, I want to turn to you now, as someone that has been involved in the CDM market for decades now. How do you see this issue, and what's your take on it?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This is indeed a watershed moment in the UNFCCC and all of those who wish to fulfill the mandate of the UNFCCC. And I find it extraordinary that the issue of CDM continuity is coming up at all, and I want to focus on the implications of lack of continuity. I must say I was impressed by Lambert's presentation insofar as the very formidable agenda for transition from the CDM to an Article 6.4 transaction, set of transactions. To me, this is indeed the work of many years, and it's necessary to ensure and protect climate action in the interim while this long process is perfected and implemented. But from a developer's perspective, let me talk about that. None of us working to alleviate poverty, to address climate change and address the health and well-being of the poorest communities in the world, as we focus on LDCs, ever anticipated a lack of continuity of the CDM, that from the beginning of next year, activities that have been in place or could be supported from next year on would not lead to issuance, would not lead to revenue, and would not lead to action either for sustainable development or for mitigating climate change. It's not anticipated because there is no sunset clause on the CDM, and nobody, including parties who constructed entire regimes around this, like the government of Korea, could have anticipated that there would be this lack of continuity. What does it mean from a development perspective? Well, I can tell you that CQC is a small player on a global stage, but we are larger than many, and we are involved in significant emissions reductions activities for a number of parties, and especially for the Korean compliance regime. We have foregone a total of $42 million of investment, inward investment, because of this continuity issue, just coming out of the blue. That's comprised of 600,000 households receiving clean cooking services across Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, Kenya, Uganda, 9 million LEDs for the rural poor in India, and 100,000 stoves for the rural poor in Laos and Cambodia, and 100,000 in Guatemala. 6 million people will not get the benefits of these investments because of this continuity issue. I have to say that, yes, from a climate perspective, you could be cynical and say, well, these don't add up to a lot in terms of managing climate change, but I can assure you they add up to a lot in terms of sustainable development and the direction of change that's necessary to address climate change long term. But what are the implications for these? Well, there are also ongoing activities that have been successful, have been issuing emissions reductions, have been generating revenues that go to the communities, go to staff on the ground, and support the ongoing investments. They're going to stop. And it's unclear when those issuances could occur. In the very best of circumstances, the CMP will decide on some transition, probably November, December next year, and then there could be issuance later in the following year. Unless, of course, the CDM Executive Board decides to do the responsible thing and ensure continuity. But the broader market context here is very important to understand. I mentioned that we are one part of a large set of developers, but most of the developers in this space are small-scale entities. They do not have the financial depth for continuity with a collapse of revenue from the CDM during the course of the next year to 2 years while the parties decide on continuity. And yet they're facing the challenge that we all face, scaling up efforts to address an ever more important global crisis. Most of those small-scale developers use the CDM. The CDM dominates in the emissions reduction space. It's true that voluntary market players like Vera VCS and Gold Standard are expanding and will play a much larger role in the future. But for now, the CDM is the only significant game in town. And these developers depend on it for cash. Their beneficiaries depend on it for livelihood changes. There is no financial depth for them to withstand the shock. So I feel we're at a kind of watershed here. I don't believe the case is made in any moral or ethical sense not to continue the CDM. I understand the governance structure issue of continuity that's been caused by the global pandemic, but I think it would be not only irresponsible, but harmful to the sustainable development cause of the convention and to managing climate change, not to find a pragmatic and reasonable way forward. And to my mind, this means all eyes are on the CDM Executive Board. We know in the development community, and those of us who've been involved in this process since the 80s, We know the CDM Executive Board can make these decisions, and it's the responsible thing to do. But please bear in mind the consequences, the reputational risk for the UN system, and the contradiction in a time of a pandemic to prevent inward investment and ongoing activity. Please bear that in mind as you make these decisions towards the end of this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken, and we'll likely come back to some of those topics later if we have time. But I want to turn to Sandra now and get your take on this issue, both as an Article 6 and CDM expert, of course, but also as a representative from an African state. Sandra, what do you make of this?
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. And well, as you say, my intervention is certainly colored by the African position in this debate, and African countries have been having a very strong interest in the topic of CDM transition in the Article 6 negotiation, and especially continuation of small-scale projects with high sustainable development benefits, and certainly programmatic approaches which are just starting to get larger in Africa and to begin, and were undertaken with a far larger time frame in mind. And I think Ken's intervention just underscored this point very clearly. So certainly we all recognize the predicament that the CDM Executive Board finds itself to decide on an issue that should have been resolved a long time ago, and latest in Madrid last year by the CMP. But the fact also is that we are now standing at a cliff and or a watershed moment, and the action that the CDM Executive Board will take will influence the next move. And so I think it's very important that any decision, any action the CDM Executive Board takes keeps the options open for the CMP to come in hopefully next year and take a decision, and also to enable and facilitate decisions by the CMP next year. And I also want to bring up the bigger picture that that we are dealing with. As Amy already introduced at the beginning, we are no longer really in a vacuum on CDM transition, but a lot has happened. And I think that in Madrid, parties actually did manage to make a big jump ahead in agreeing on a certain road for the CDM transition. Of course, Article 6 has not been agreed, but we see an emerging compromise on CDM transition, which is that eligible CDM projects can transition to Article 6.4, and they may use CDM methodologies during a transition period, which is either 2023, so the early of 2023, or when their crediting period needs to be renewed. And then transition CDM activities can be issued Article 6.4 ERs. And that seems to be quite a robust compromise in a way, because if you look at the different iterations of the presidency text from Madrid, you see very little change on the substance. There is some reshuffling of numberings, but the essence seems to be quite a stable solution for such a contentious debate. So I think wherever we are now going should not chart a different course, but enable this general compromise where hopefully parties may be going. And just to question what would be needed then on a practical level, that what parties were leaning towards in Madrid can also become reality. I think there are 2 points. One is certainly that once Article 6.4 becomes operational, there's still an active CDM pipeline around which can be transitioned. And the second aspect, and I think this is what both Lambert and Amy already focused on, is it's very important that there's a division of roles between the CDM Executive Board and the Article 6.4 supervisory body. I mean, probably in the best case scenario, we'll have an Article 6.4 supervisory body sometime in, let's say, 2022, and it will have a lot on its plate. So implicit in having this kind of transition period is probably that the CDM Executive Board and the SB will have to share their roles in an effective manner to be able to deal with this grand challenge of making Article 6.4 operational and handling the transition. And I would certainly agree with Lambert that the priority for the Article 6.4 SB would be on operationalizing the mechanism, which probably gives the body then less time to deal with project-specific issues such as issuance, registration, and so forth. So just in terms of how can these bodies practically work together, I would think that it would be needed for the CDM Executive Board to continue to play a role here. Well, to keep basically the SB also free to focus on the necessary regulatory issues. So just coming back to what that means right now for where we are, for where the Executive Board is at the moment, I think 2 things. One is that I would see a relevance for all the functions to continue post 2020, including new registrations, but also issuances of CRs. Not exactly sure I agree with what Lambert said, that there's necessarily a gap in the issuance. There would be if only A64 ERs would be issued, but if you would think of an issuance by the CDM Executive Board in a pending account, just to keep it there and then have other bodies, other schemes decide later about the use. I think this would be a way of ensuring the smooth transition in the spirit of Article 6.4 as well. And I think the second issue that would be very helpful coming from the CDM Executive Board would be to really prepare the decisions that can be taken during the next COP in Glasgow. So for instance, those critical issues on global warming potentials, or how to deal with serial numbers, to adopt on a provisional basis some good practices, so that then later on those could be vetted or not by the CMP. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandra. And I'm conscious that we are really at the top of the hour, and we do have a really strict schedule as part of the Carbon Market Pavilion. But I want to see if any of the panelists or of the presenter want to react to anything that was said during the presentations and the interventions. This is your last chance.
Hey, yeah, so why not take that opportunity? I think it's very good we use the word watershed moment, because I think, you know, despite all these arguments that were given here, and, you know, it was sure from the outset that this was going to be, you know, people delivering their different perspectives on a certain topic. But I think, you know, in adding to that, it's just also very important to recognize that on 1st of January 2021, there is indeed a watershed moment. That is the implementation of Paris, with a whole new system of rules and principles that we have agreed on in 2015. And you know, it's just something that we can't ignore. We can go into these details. We have to keep discussing constructively, and as Amy said, you know, be light touch in this transition issue. But I think it's yeah, I mean, it's not the full truth if we try to portray it in a way that there's watershed only in that one sense.
I would just add that if people are concerned about the attitude of the host countries, the DNAs have repeatedly requested the CDM in recent months to ensure continuity of the CDM. In other words, representations by the DNAs of the developing countries to the CDM Executive Board to make the decision for continuity. That should be a good enough evidence that the host countries do not want to see disruption in inward investment or ongoing revenues from existing activities.
Thanks. Any last word? Lambert, I saw that you put the camera back on.
Yeah, maybe a few words. So one is, I think the CDM Executive Board is really having a hard time and is well aware of all these aspects, is well aware of the difficult situation that creates for project participants. But there are different views and there are operational and legal issues. And just to explain my personal view or my personal concerns, I think there's one political consideration, that this is something to be discussed by parties. And as Sandra put it, the CDM Executive Board should not take decisions which preempt what parties may want to decide. So that's kind of one limitation. And it's not, in my personal view, it's not within the authority of the CDM Executive Board to decide, yes, we continue the CDM. Politically, there's a Paris Agreement, and probably it hasn't been intended that the CDM and the 6.4 mechanism operate in parallel, right? But if we would, as a CDM Executive Board, continue the CDM and take that decision, the two mechanisms may operate in parallel. And then there are technical and legal issues. So the technically issuing CRs would breach existing CMP decisions, which are related to how the ITL and the CDM registry works, etc. But so there are political and technical and operational issues. But having said all that, the CDM Executive Board is looking in ways to find kind of solutions for an interim period, and that's subject to confidential discussions, of course. But the board is having a hard time in looking what is possible. Thank you.
If you allow me one quick last comment, and I think the issue is that actually everyone says the same thing in a way, right? That the CDM Executive Board shouldn't prejudge the outcome of parties. The question to me is a bit, what is the more prejudgmental decision? In my assessment, it would probably be if for some, well, accidentally, then a lot of these good projects would not survive the time until a decision is taken, right? So that that could be kind of definite. But I'm actually very heartened that these discussions seem to be constructive now in the CDM Executive Board, and certainly we're all very curious about the outcome in December.
Me too.
Thanks, Sandra, and thank you all. I'm really afraid we need to bring this to a close, because otherwise it will just fuel comments from my colleagues about Italians being late on all the time. So yeah, I'm really afraid we are out of time, and we are bringing this session to a close. I just want to thank all the panelists and presenters for an excellent discussion. I think we did a good job, and by we, I mean you did a good job at depicting what the issue is, and also bringing to the table different perspectives and different points of view, which is really what we want to achieve today, together with you know, hopefully explaining people why these issues are so complex. So again, thanks to all of you, and there will be other chances to move this discussion forward, and we look forward to stay engaged with you all. And Luca, over to you for a closing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stefano. And just to say thanks to all our panelists. I think it was a super discussion for 1 hour. We covered a lot of topics, very different sides of the spectrum, and look forward to see how the discussion going forward. Sorry to our attendees that we couldn't take all the questions, the very good questions that were in the chat, but we were limited in time. And yeah, once again, thanks again, and look forward to continuing working on this and discussing on these topics with you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.